and I don't think it will be worse for your time. I don't think you should just read it. Whatever I'm trying to say, you should read it. Hello, my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel, Springboard Thought. Today I'm doing a weekly reads sort of thing where I do my wrap-ups. Sometimes I do it more than weekly, but that's more or less what it is. Friday reads, weekly reads, whatever you want to call it. Hopefully I'm sounding okay. I have a little bit of brain fog because I've got sinus, cold, congestion stuff happening. It really knocked me on my butt for like the entire week. I'm on the mend though, but hopefully I can articulate these thoughts in a succinct manner. I read 11 books, but only 9 of them I'll talk about because 2 of them are Book2 prize books, which allowed me to submit my ballot early, as I always do. This time I hadn't read any of the books though, so it took me a little bit of a while, like 15 days or whatever, from the time that I got the books. Maybe like 5 days into the month or something. The first book I read was Goliath by Tochi Onyebuchi, and this book was fantastic. It's a 5-star adult sci-fi book. I had previously read their novella Riot Baby, I believe is what it's called. It focused on the prison system, on socioeconomic disadvantages, and a lot of like complex character work, but also supernatural type stuff happening. It was pretty good. I didn't like it as much as most people generally did, I think, but I was very interested to see what they would do next, and I'm glad that I've followed it up because this book was just phenomenal. So it's a biblical retelling. It's non-linear, it's very complex, it's very dense. The prose work is excellent. It's very like lyrical. It doesn't hold your hand. It's talking about same sort of socioeconomic problems. It centers on community, who and what people cater to in capitalism, where it's going, sort of the means of selection by way of like a parable story pretty much. I consumed this on audio. The audiobook was quite good, but I'm going to get it in a physical copy and read it because I 100% know that I didn't catch everything with the book that I wanted to through the audio, even though I was paying quite a bit of attention to it. So I'm actually really looking forward to pretty much immediately rereading it as soon as it becomes affordable. It's a little bit pricey at like $35 Canadian here right now, or maybe I'll get it from the library, who knows, we'll see. But if I ever see this like on Book Outlet or something like that, it would be like an instant buy for me. So yeah, there's not too much that I can go into succinctly about it because it's very epic. If you think of, yeah, like an epic fantasy book, but sci-fi, multiple characters, non-linear, you really have to pay attention to make a cohesive whole from it. There are sections that feel superfluous until you get to sections of the book that it suddenly becomes very pertinent. So it's very my type of writing, basically. It's very literary as far as I can see. Yeah, it's just phenomenal. And I highly recommend it. It's going to be on my top 10 books of the year probably. Then I read 2001: A Space Odyssey by Arthur C. Clarke. I have a lovely Galaxy edition of this. I have the whole set, and so I was looking to consume these. I read this with Sarah from Freshly Read Books and Gem of Books and Sandy from Miss Reads a Lot. And we previously read Blade Runner, or Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, depending on the version of the book that you buy. And this book definitely, it was fine, basically. I gave it 2 stars because it, I think, didn't justify its actual, like, imperative of the book. Like, I would say it's 2.5 stars because technically it tells the story, it does have a conclusion, but what it builds up to is really, it feels more like fantasy than sci-fi to me. And Sarah from Freshly Read Books mentioned that in the introduction it says that Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke, who did these books in a conjoint effort, didn't know what the ending was going to be. They hit like a 2/3 mark and then decided kind of together, ostensibly at least, because I haven't read this introduction, where it was going. And that's very much what this story feels like. In the 3/4 mark, it is a techno-evolution story of humanity in which at a like prehistoric age, or not prehistoric, but at an evolutionary stage of mankind, from what we view humanity has evolved from, they encounter a monolith which makes them evolve, basically. And it charts the technological evolution of humanity up to a certain point in which they're receiving signals, like it could be a first contact story, or they might be encountering an alien civilization that's gone, left, dead and buried, just because of the amount of time that's gone by since all of this stuff is occurring. It's a very quiet story. There's not a lot of conflict. Interestingly, it comments on the fact that humanity creates an AI and then generally does a bad job with its creation and things go awry, which is maybe the more action-y part of the story, I suppose. But even that is handled in like 3 chapters or something. It's like 20 pages. You think it's going to be like the denouement, but it's not at all. And then the ending is just terrible. It's terrible. I hated it, basically. Yeah, it didn't work for me. Goes into fantasy land. Doesn't say that much about actual history or techno-evolution of mankind because it goes in this fantastical direction. It just, I can kind of see it as a sort of like sci-fi reclaiming biblical tale type thing, but it's just so weird and out there and stupid, basically, that I just couldn't care less. Then I read Very Cold People by Sarah Manguso on audio, read by Rebecca Lowman. And this book was a 4-star read for me. I really liked it. It's a short novella. It is exactly what it says it is on the tin. There's a girl who charts the history of her family and her growing up. It's almost like a Bildungsroman, but not really, because by the end of it, she's like not super grown up yet. So almost, I guess. And basically we uncover family secrets, the dynamics of why they're so cold to each other, what family history looks like in the extended family, what has been sort of passed down from different generations, what's been internalized, what she's internalizing, her school life, and her friendship with like other people and stuff like that. It reads quite quickly. I really like the prose work. The narration was excellent at augmenting the prose that I think would have been okay on the page and not great. But the narration just really accentuates the exact right parts of the writing, I think, which is great. Yeah, it was just very solid stuff, quite dark, deals with abuse, critical of socioeconomic stuff as well, and especially of rich people. I like to see that kind of stuff. I very much enjoyed it. Upright Women Wanted by Sarah Gailey. This was on audio as well, narrated by Romy Nordlinger, I think. This one I would actually steer you away from on the audiobook. The narration was quite terrible. It was like an old lady narrating an adolescent, basically. It was laughably bad at sometimes for the narration. It's a reimagining of a Western in which librarians, some of which are queer, are safeguarding knowledge essentially and are the leftists of the story. Other people are attacking and encroaching on them. The main character has done something ostensibly wrong and fleed from them directly to the librarians, seeking sanctuary for a very specific thing about their identity. And it's basically just leading up to the point of whether she's going to go with them or not. So it's quite quick, like novella type length. It was like a 4-hour audiobook, so that's what I would imagine the book to be like. I'm not sure though. Solid stuff. I gave it 3 stars. I probably would have given it 4 stars if I could assess the prose and enjoyed it more, but the narration was just so bad. Next, I consumed A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. This book was phenomenal. This I thought was going to be a retelling of Dracula through the perspective of the bride, but it's not. It is a reimagining of their dynamic, I guess. Like, she is sired by him, and throughout the ages it shows their relationship dynamics and how they become basically a queer couple that invites other people into their bed and family, like found family aspects, increasing their numbers. It becomes very queer, I think. And then I can't find the listing for the audiobook that I listened to, but you should definitely consume this on audio. It is meant to be spoken aloud. It's very lyrical, it's very poetic, and the audiobook narrator understood the assignment. Like, it's melodramatic, it's breathy, it's like sexy. She sells the hell out of this book. The book itself, of course, is quite good as well, but I don't think you could envision the way that she tells the story in your own head. So if you can get this book on audio, definitely do it. It's very quick, and it should have been truncated a little bit, I think. It spins its wheel in the middle half a little bit, but it's just so enjoyable to listen to or consume. Next, I did I Must Betray You by Ruta Sepetys, and narrated by Edoardo Bellerini. This was a very fast YA book that centered on the genocide, the revolution in Romania, and centers on a boy who is caught in the politics of things when he is just trying to grow up. So it's kind of like a buildings Roman, but again, he doesn't really grow up. Like, there's a disillusionment of innocence and stuff like that, but by the end of it, it's been like 6 months kind of deal. So kind of. I prefer buildings Roman to be like, they actually grow up, but who knows how often that actually happens with that trope these days. Essentially, the politicking and the way that the system of government is constructed is everybody is informing on other people. People are dying, people are being leveraged, people are being used, some of which for like sexual exploitation and things like that. It's based on actual research that the author had done, apparently, according to the back, and otherwise it was just very straightforward and kind of boring. The characters were cardboard cutouts that are used as plot devices for every single plot beat. You can tell exactly where it's going, you know who the person who's the informer is, you know every twist that's coming. It's just kind of a foregone conclusion, especially if you know historically what happens. But I mean, maybe it surprises some people, I'm not sure. I saw this on some channel and they had recommended it, but it didn't work for me. I gave it 2 stars. I definitely wouldn't recommend it. Maybe if you're super into YA, don't know anything about Romania, and really like that trope conjoined with the half buildings Roman thing, then maybe you'd get something out of it. Next, I read Go Home, Ricky by Jean Kwok. This is a fantastic book, and I picked it up because it's Pride Month and I thought it was a queer read. It's not. Perhaps the author is queer, but I'm not sure. I didn't look into that. This is about a white person who believes that they are like half or a quarter Cherokee or some other ancestral denomination like that in the United States, and they have a wrestling persona called something, I think Ricky Two Hatchet, something Two Hatchet anyway. Essentially they suffer a really, I would say, pretty bad injury. They have to wear a neck brace for a while. Their routine is like disrupted. They're injured, their partner isn't, and so kind of starts a cascade of their life events of like one wrong thing chained to another, basically, like bad luck conjoined with bad luck conjoined with bad luck kind of deal. They're in a relationship with somebody who they thought it was going quite well with. She gets pregnant and decides to abort the baby. He feels he isn't like consulted on this enough. He breaks up with her. He then alienates his mother because she tells him about his father being something about his father basically instigates him to shun the mother and go looking for the father on his motorcycle. And in this entire book, he's wearing a neck brace, at least for 3/4 of it. It is very satirical in its outlook of this sort of like hoodlum, trashy white male person who essentially adopts or compromises, or what's the word I'm looking for, co-ops indigenous culture for their own gain without kind of doing any research into it, or looking into like his actual family or his community or anything like that. He's essentially just trying to cash in on the aesthetics of the thing in the very white area of WrestleMania and that kind of stuff. He's never really gone up in his career. He's always been kind of a washout. He's always been kind of like this loser guy. And so it becomes a very largely satirical look, but very also human look at this guy who you should find reprehensible and hate, yet is so well rendered that you actually find like a lot of compassion for him. There's a lot of systemic issues that have been pressed onto him that would leave his life to this inevitability. Even in his like, I don't know, even movie-esque way of like, I'm gonna go find my father and everything will be sorted then kind of deal. It's very intersectional in its look of like masculinity, of white culture lacking culture, essentially, and therefore why white people like to co-opt other people's cultures into their own, what mainstream culture is doing all of the time, / pop culture, and just like all facets of masculinity from positive to toxic, basically. He develops friendships with other men that are turned into toxic relationships. He makes his own problems. He doesn't treat women very well, but thinks he does. It's laugh out loud, funny at some times, and it's just extremely well written. The voice crafted for the character is absolutely impeccable. It is like shortstop sentences that kind of remind me of Hemingway when he's at his best. It doesn't have the same momentum or the same musicality, but it fits the character because that's like, it's his quintessential nature put on the page, and you never really doubt what's happening. His view, as solipsistic as it is, makes a lot of sense, and it's a part of the critique of the actual work. So I thought it was phenomenal. I gave it 5 stars. This is a contender for the Booker next year, apparently, because the paperback is being published over there. This year, it just barely didn't make the cut, which is too bad because I think it's a phenomenal book. Next, I consumed A Tiny Upward Shove by Melissa Chadbourne. This is another book that I don't have the narrator of because Goodreads doesn't have it. And I can't add a new edition in this new Goodreads page thing. Like, I navigated to all editions and there's no manually add a book or anything. So inevitably I return the book and then I forget who the translator or who the narrator was. Regardless, A Tiny Upward Shove is about a woman in Penticton, BC, who is murdered, and a spirit guardian type situation, supernatural occurrence happens. Throughout her family, she has this spirit that has been watching over them and trying to guide the women to some sort of restful peace after they've met with like violent ends. I believe it is a South Asian thing that I can't remember exactly, so I wouldn't want to misstate here, but it's a South Asian being of some kind, and through it, this now spirit, the narrator of the story, essentially deep dives into everybody, including the victim, as well as the perpetrator and the family around the person, in order to understand the events of what have just occurred, in order to see what the spirit, needs to do in order to find justice for the victim. So you get a really, really in-depth dive into the childhood and socioeconomic upbringing of the person, who ends up being a sex worker, someone who was neglected by her mother, somebody who goes into the child welfare system, and yeah, just kind of never has a chance. And then we also springboard into the perpetrator, the killer, who is based on a real person, William Picton, a Canadian, I believe, killer who is suspected of murdering a lot of people, many of them Indigenous women in Canada. And then we see how this sort of outcome was an inevitable outcropping of their upbringing and where they sort of was charted to go in life. And then the justice, essentially, that comes after, as well as what is said in the synopsis, mercy, and what that kind of looks like. It's a very human story. It's very effective. I gave it 5 stars. It's very brave. It is really not shying away from depicting the terrible events that occur. So not necessarily the murder from what I remember, but there's sexual violence to minors. There's sexual violence done to adults. There's a lot of sexual connotations in the way in which men are leveraging women, and then therefore how women perceive themselves as they grow up and become sex workers, and their skewed relationship to sex and their bodies and their empowerment with their body and whatnot, and how they use their body and traverse society in general. So it can be a very brutal book. There's some people that DNF the book simply because they just weren't in the right headspace for it. So I would definitely evaluate where you are in your headspace before consuming it. But if you're in a place to consume it, I definitely would. It doesn't have enough ratings as it is. I think it's a phenomenal book. Very well written. The narration was absolutely excellent. It was one of the best books that I've read this year so far. And just really astounding at what it's able to accomplish and the sort of humanity it's able to imbue, while just from trying to form a comprehensive view of the actual events that have occurred beyond motive, opportunity, weapon, and perpetrator, basically, including not erasing the victim from the equation. Completely phenomenal work, I think. And then lastly, another 5-star read for me I just finished today was The High House by Jesse Greengrass. This was narrated by Sam Newton. This is a cli-fi book that's literary and essentially like a character study, essentially. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. So I think a lot of people will pick this up because they want science and they want something that's sort of like combating the dystopic elements of climate fiction or cli-fi, or just wanting to know more about climate effects happening on specific regions. But this is not concerned with that. It's taking place in a world where that is occurring, but it's not the main focus of the book. Instead, it focuses on a family that's a bit odd. There seems to be no father, yet there's a son. There's a sister, a pair of sisters, and then there's the father of them. And essentially what ends up happening, I need to stop saying essentially, I've been saying that a lot. I'm tired. But basically what ends up happening is it shows this strange tensions and stark realities of living in a world where this tension has been imbued in a particular family member. The mother of the child is not really present for the child's life because she is constantly prioritizing going to these conferences and ostensibly it's like science conferences trying to combat climate effects and stuff. We're not really sure. But what is sure is she feels it's a moral imperative that she has to leave her child. The result of which is the child kind of like imprints on the sister who is present all of the time. The father also leaves quite often along with her as they sort of get galvanized and the world gets worse, essentially. And so because of this rift, this schism, the High House is sort of crafted, created, constructed by the mother who leaves. It's the only way she's able to sort of save her child from this destruction that's being wrought on the world. And it's called the High House because it's very high up, so flooding won't reach them, right? They're as sustainable as possible, but they're also isolated. It becomes a very human tale about how the dynamics in a family replicate themselves onto the dynamics of how the world is reacting to this sort of realization or the dystopic elements of the climate fiction, which is really genius. It shows how some people are very selfish or very altruistic, depending on circumstances, depending on who they can see in front of them. The empathy that they're able to project onto other people rarely extends to people they cannot see, and hence why we're in the position we are, where this is all going. So you get a very stark, realistic look, I think, as to what will happen to this family, what happens to the world. Yet it's also not hopeless. It is very much a subjective ending, I think, in which a lot of different things could happen, and it kind of points to maybe a negative ending overall, but not necessarily like a poor life lived or any situation like that. In some ways, they're very privileged. In many ways, they're very privileged in the outcomes of what they are able to achieve. And it's got 3 characters, 3 narrators, all of which are impeccable, very well delivered. This is a book I would definitely recommend on audio. It's one of my favorite audiobooks now. And yeah, it's just an absolutely fantastic story. And this is eligible for the Booker Prize. So if I were to make a prediction list and the judges were to keep it off, I would riot. No, I'm just kidding. But it should definitely be a long-listed Booker book, I think. And leave your thoughts, opinions in the comments below, and I will see you next time. Bye. Sinuses that are being destroyed at this very moment, like the climate.